March 17, 1945, 05:47 hours, Seelow Heights, Eastern Front. Gefreiter Klaus Becker crouched in a frozen trench, holding a weapon that had already killed more German soldiers than Soviet tanks. He did not know this yet. 22 years old, 3 weeks of training. The Panzerfaust in his hands weighed 11 pounds and could punch through 200 millimeters of armor. Klaus had fired it exactly once. The backblast had knocked him forward and left his ears ringing for 20 minutes. The instructor told him he missed the target by 4 meters. Then the instructor told him something that Klaus tried very hard to forget. 40% of Panzerfaust operators die in their first engagement. Most of them are killed by their own weapon. Klaus looked at the soldier crouched next to him. 17 years old. Name was Josef Hartmann. Josef had been a student 6 weeks ago. Now he clutched his own Panzerfaust with hands that would not stop shaking. Josef asked Klaus if he knew how to use the weapon. Klaus lied and said yes. Josef asked if they would survive. Klaus did not answer. 3 hours earlier, an officer had handed Klaus the Panzerfaust without any instructions. The officer was 19. He had been in command for 8 days. Before that, he had been studying engineering in Munich. The officer told Klaus that Soviet tanks would arrive at dawn. Klaus asked how many. The officer said enough. Then the officer walked away and started distributing more Panzerfausts to soldiers who had never seen combat. Klaus tried to remember the training manual. 14 pages. He got through 6 before exhaustion made him fall asleep. The manual was clear about one thing: the backblast zone. A cone of fire 30 feet long erupting from the rear of the tube when fired. Anyone within 10 meters would be incinerated. Anyone within 15 meters would suffer severe burns. The manual said to clear all personnel before firing. The manual said never fire from enclosed spaces. The manual said many things that were impossible to follow in actual combat. 05:49 hours, 11 minutes until sunrise. Klaus heard something that made his stomach turn. Screaming, not from pain, from burning. The trench 40 meters to his left. A soldier had just fired his Panzerfaust. Klaus watched what happened next and understood why the instructor had said 40%. The soldier had fired from inside a concrete bunker. The backblast had nowhere to go. It filled the enclosed space with superheated gas and flame. 3 soldiers were trying to climb out. Their uniforms were on fire. Their skin was on fire. One of them made it 5 steps before he collapsed. The other 2 did not make it out of the bunker at all. Klaus could hear them dying. Josef grabbed Klaus by the arm. His voice was breaking. "Did you see that?" Klaus nodded. Josef asked what they were supposed to do. Klaus looked at the narrow trench they were crouched in. 4 other soldiers were pressed against the dirt 3 meters behind them. If Klaus or Josef fired their Panzerfausts in this trench, the backblast would hit all 4 of those soldiers. Klaus understood the choice he was facing. Let Soviet tanks kill everyone, or kill his own men trying to stop the tanks. Josef was still waiting for an answer. Klaus told him they would figure it out. Josef did not look convinced. 05:52 hours, 8 minutes until sunrise. The soldier in the bunker who had made it 5 steps was still alive, still screaming. No one went to help him. There was no medic. There were no medical supplies. There was nothing anyone could do except listen to him die. Klaus tried not to listen, but the sound carried across the frozen ground. The man was begging, begging for someone to shoot him, begging for the pain to stop. An officer finally walked over and put a bullet in his head. The screaming stopped. Klaus felt relieved and then felt sick for feeling relieved. Josef was crying, not loudly, just tears running down his face. Klaus wanted to tell him it would be okay, but that would be a lie. Nothing was okay. 3 German soldiers had just burned to death because one soldier fired a weapon he did not know how to use. Klaus looked down at his own Panzerfaust and realized he was holding the same weapon. He did not know how to use it either. He had fired it once in training and missed the target. Now he was supposed to destroy Soviet tanks with it, while avoiding killing his own men with the backblast. The logic made no sense. The weapon was designed to save German soldiers, but it kept killing them instead. 0555 hours. 5 minutes until sunrise. Klaus heard voices. 2 soldiers in the next trench were arguing. One wanted to retreat. The other said retreating meant execution. Hitler had issued the order 3 weeks ago. Any soldier who abandoned his position would be shot. The penalty for cowardice was death. The penalty for desertion was death. The soldier who wanted to retreat asked what the penalty for staying was. The other soldier did not answer. They both knew. The penalty for staying was also death. The only question was whether they died from Soviet tanks or German bullets. Klaus thought about the weapon in his hands. The Panzerfaust had been created in 1942 when Germany was losing the war. Soviet T-34 tanks were crushing German positions. German engineers needed a weapon that was cheap and simple. The Panzerfaust was both. It cost 30 Reichsmarks to make. A rifle cost 70. By 1943, Germany was producing 200,000 Panzerfausts per month because they had run out of everything else. The weapon was brilliant in design: a steel tube, a shaped charge warhead, a trigger, aim at tank, pull trigger. Warhead punches through armor and turns the crew into burning corpses in less than 2 seconds. But the backblast was not a design flaw. It was physics. The explosion had to go somewhere. German engineers directed it backward to save the operator, but that created new problems. The backblast killed anyone standing behind the weapon. It burned anyone standing nearby. It turned enclosed spaces into ovens. Klaus had read about this in the manual. He had seen it happen 40 meters away 3 minutes ago. Now he was supposed to use this weapon without killing the 4 soldiers crouched in the trench behind him. 0557 hours. 3 minutes until sunrise. Klaus heard the first explosion, Soviet artillery landing 200 meters behind the German lines. The barrage had started. This was standard Soviet doctrine. Saturate the target area with artillery for 30 minutes, then send in the tanks. The shells were not aimed at anything specific. They were aimed at grid coordinates. Soviet commanders did not care about accuracy. They cared about volume. 10,000 shells landing in the same area would destroy everything whether the gunners could see it or not. The shells landed closer. 150 meters. 100 meters. Klaus pressed himself into the frozen dirt. Josef was praying. Klaus could not hear the words over the explosions, but he could see Josef's lips moving. A shell landed in the trench to the right. The entire section collapsed. Klaus did not know how many soldiers had been in that trench. He did not want to know. No one tried to dig them out. There was no time. 0604 hours. The artillery stopped. Klaus lifted his head. The sun was breaking over the horizon. He could see shapes moving through the morning fog, dozens of them, then hundreds. T-34 tanks advancing in a line that stretched across the entire battlefield. Klaus started counting. He got to 23 before he stopped. There were too many. His hands started shaking. Josef grabbed his arm. How are we supposed to stop that many? Klaus did not answer because he did not have an answer. The math was simple. They had 2 Panzerfausts. There were hundreds of tanks. Even if every shot hit a target, they would die long before they ran out of tanks to shoot at. The T-34s kept advancing. 600 meters. 500 meters. Klaus could see details now. The sloped armor, the 76mm gun, the red star on the turret. These were not burning wrecks from propaganda photos. These were functional war machines with experienced crews. Soviet tankers had been fighting for 4 years. They knew how to kill German infantry. 400 meters. A soldier in the trench to the left stood up and ran. He dropped his Panzerfaust and climbed out and sprinted toward the rear. An officer pulled out a pistol and shot him in the back. The soldier fell face first into the mud and did not move. The officer shouted that the next person who ran would get the same. Klaus believed him. That officer had just killed a German soldier for trying to survive. He would kill Klaus just as easily. 300 meters. Klaus heard screaming again. Different trench. A soldier had panicked and fired his Panzerfaust too early. The warhead sailed wide and exploded in empty dirt. But the backblast hit two soldiers who had been standing too close. They were on fire. They tried to roll in the frozen mud to extinguish the flames. A Soviet machine gunner saw movement and opened fire. Both soldiers stopped moving. Klaus watched this happen and understood something terrible. The Panzerfaust was killing Germans faster than it was killing Soviets. Joseph saw it too. His voice was barely a whisper. "We are going to die." Klaus wanted to disagree, but he could not. Joseph was right. They were going to die. The only question was how. Burned by their own weapons, shot by their own officers, crushed by Soviet tanks, killed by Soviet machine guns. There were so many ways to die, and only one way to survive, and that way did not exist. 200 meters. The Soviet tanks spread out and started firing their main guns, high explosive shells. The concussion alone would kill anyone within 20 meters. Klaus watched a shell land in the trench to the right. The trench just disappeared. Smoke and dirt and nothing else. 5 soldiers had been there 3 seconds ago. Now there was a crater. Klaus aimed his Panzerfaust at the nearest tank. His hands were shaking so badly the sight kept moving. Joseph was next to him doing the same thing. Klaus looked behind him. 4 soldiers crouched in the trench 3 meters away. If Klaus fired now, those soldiers would burn. If Klaus did not fire, the tank would kill them anyway. Klaus shouted at the 4 soldiers to move back. They stared at him. Klaus shouted again, "Move now, or you will die." One of them started to move. The others stayed frozen. 150 meters. A German tank appeared from the rear. A Panzer IV. Klaus felt a wave of relief. Finally. Support. The Panzer fired and hit a T-34. The Soviet tank exploded. The Panzer rotated its turret and fired again. Another T-34 destroyed. Klaus thought maybe they had a chance. Maybe the Panzer could turn the battle. Then the officer who had distributed the Panzerfausts 3 hours ago appeared in the trench. He was screaming and pointing at the Panzer IV. Klaus did not understand. The officer grabbed Klaus by the collar and put his face close. "That is not a Panzer IV. That is a captured Soviet tank disguised as a Panzer. Fire at it now, or I will shoot you myself." Klaus looked at the tank again. It looked exactly like a Panzer IV. Gray paint, German markings, black cross on the turret. But the officer was certain. Klaus did not know what to do. If he fired and the officer was right, Klaus would destroy an enemy tank. If he fired and the officer was wrong, Klaus would be executed for destroying a German tank. If he did not fire and the officer was right, everyone in this trench would die. The officer pulled out his pistol and put it against Klaus's head. "Fire now." Klaus made his choice. He lifted the Panzerfaust and aimed at the tank. Joseph was screaming something, but Klaus could not hear over the sound of his own heartbeat. Klaus looked at the 4 soldiers 3 meters behind him. They still had not moved. Klaus understood what he was about to do. He was about to kill them. His own weapon was about to kill his own men. Klaus pulled the trigger. The Panzerfaust roared. The backblast erupted like dragonfire. Klaus heard screaming before he even looked back. He turned and saw all 4 soldiers on fire. Their uniforms burning, their faces burning. They were trying to roll in the dirt, but the flames would not stop. One of them was crawling toward Klaus, reaching out. Klaus could not move. He just watched. The soldier's hand was burning. His face was melting. He stopped moving 6 feet from Klaus. Klaus looked at the tank. The warhead had hit. The tank was burning. Soviet crews were bailing out. The officer had been right. It was a captured tank. Klaus had destroyed an enemy, but he had also just killed 4 German soldiers to do it. Klaus stared at the burning men. One of them was still alive. still screaming. The sound was worse than anything Klaus had ever heard. Josef was vomiting. The smell of burning flesh had reached them. Klaus wanted to vomit too, but nothing would come out. He just stood there, holding an empty Panzerfaust tube, while men he was supposed to protect died from his own weapon. The officer grabbed Klaus and shoved another Panzerfaust into his hands. Good shot. Reload and fire again. More tanks coming. Klaus looked at the new weapon. Then he looked at the burning soldiers. Then he looked at Josef, who was staring at Klaus with absolute terror. Josef understood what had just happened. Josef understood what would happen if he fired his own Panzerfaust. Josef threw his weapon down and started climbing out of the trench. The officer shot Josef in the chest. Josef fell back into the trench. Blood was pouring from the wound. His eyes were still open. He looked at Klaus. His mouth was moving, but no sound came out. Josef died while Klaus watched. The officer picked up Josef's Panzerfaust and handed it to Klaus. "You have 2 weapons now. Use them." Klaus took the second Panzerfaust. He did not know why. His brain had stopped working. He was just following orders because orders were the only thing that made sense anymore. Klaus looked at the horizon. More T-34s advancing, at least 30 of them. Klaus looked at the 2 Panzerfausts in his hands. He looked at Josef's body. He looked at the 4 soldiers who were no longer screaming because they were no longer alive. Klaus understood what the Panzerfaust was. It was not a weapon to destroy enemy tanks. It was a weapon that destroyed everyone. Enemy, ally, operator, everyone. The backblast did not discriminate. The weapon killed whoever was nearby when it fired. Klaus lifted the first Panzerfaust and aimed at the nearest Soviet tank. His hands were not shaking anymore. He had gone past fear into something else. Acceptance, maybe, or insanity. Klaus did not care which. He pulled the trigger and the weapon roared, and another German soldier behind him started screaming, and Klaus did not look back. He just picked up the second Panzerfaust and aimed at the next tank and pulled the trigger again. July 3rd, 1944. 0920 hours. Military Tribunal Chamber, Rastenburg, East Prussia. Major General Heinrich Brenner sat in the gallery watching a man beg for his life. The man was Hauptmann Ernst Weber, 38 years old, tank commander, 15th Panzer Division. Weber had commanded a Panther tank during the retreat from Minsk 2 weeks earlier. Now he stood before 3 judges accused of murdering a German soldier. Weber was screaming that the charge was insane. The soldier he killed had just destroyed Weber's tank and murdered his entire crew. The prosecutor asked Weber to describe what happened. Weber's voice broke. July 19th. Soviet forces attacking. Weber's Panther was providing covering fire for retreating German infantry. A Panzerfaust team was positioned in a barn 40 meters from Weber's tank. The team fired. Direct hit to the engine compartment. The fuel tank exploded. Weber's driver burned to death in his seat. The radio operator died trying to escape through the burning crew compartment. The gunner made it out, but died from his burns 6 hours later. Weber survived because he was standing in the turret hatch when the warhead hit. Weber climbed out of the burning tank. He saw the Panzerfaust team celebrating. They thought they had destroyed a Soviet tank. Weber ran to the barn. He was covered in burns. His uniform was smoking. He found the team leader and asked why they had fired. The team leader said he saw a tank firing toward German positions and assumed it was Soviet. Weber told him it was a German Panther. The team leader looked at the burning wreckage and started crying. Weber pulled out his pistol and shot the team leader in the head. Then he shot the 2 other members of the Panzerfaust team. Then he walked back to German lines and reported what happened. The prosecutor asked if Weber understood he had executed 3 German soldiers. Weber said yes. The prosecutor asked if Weber had any justification. Weber screamed that those 3 soldiers had murdered his crew. They had destroyed a German tank because they were too incompetent to identify their own armor. They deserved to die. The prosecutor said the Panzerfaust team had been following their training. They had been ordered to fire at any tank within range. They had made an honest mistake. Weber laughed. It was not a sane laugh. Weber said if executing incompetent soldiers was a crime, then Germany should execute every officer who had ordered Panzerfausts distributed to untrained recruits. The judges conferred for 3 minutes. They found Weber guilty of murdering 3 German soldiers. The sentence was death by firing squad. Execution scheduled for July 5th at dawn. Weber did not react. He just stood there, staring at the judges. Then he said something that made Brenner's blood turn cold. Weber said the judges could execute him, but it would not change anything. Panzerfausts were destroying more German tanks every day. The judges were sentencing Weber to death for killing 3 soldiers, but they were doing nothing about a weapon that was killing hundreds. The judges ordered Weber removed from the courtroom. Weber kept screaming as the guards dragged him away. He screamed that Germany was murdering its own soldiers and calling it a war effort. Brenner sat in the gallery trying to process what he had just witnessed. Brenner was 53 years old, 28 years of service. He commanded the Casualty Analysis Division at Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. Brenner tracked German losses: tanks, aircraft, artillery, personnel. He had spent 3 years compiling reports that documented how Germany was losing the war. But he had never seen a man executed for exposing a systemic failure. Weber had killed 3 soldiers who destroyed a German tank. The judges executed Weber for murder. But no one was investigating why the Panzerfaust team had destroyed their own tank in the first place. Brenner left the tribunal and walked back to his office. He found Captain Franz Müller waiting for him. Müller was 31 years old, combat veteran, Eastern Front. Müller had been assigned to Brenner's division 6 months earlier. Müller's job was investigating armor losses, specifically investigating why German tanks were being destroyed at rates that did not match enemy contact reports. Müller had spent 4 months compiling data. Now Müller sat in Brenner's office with a folder marked Secret. Brenner asked if Müller had attended the tribunal. Müller said yes. Brenner asked what Müller thought. Müller said Weber was guilty of murder and the sentence was justified. Then Müller said something else. Müller said Weber was also right. Panzerfausts were destroying German tanks. Müller had the numbers. Brenner told Müller to show him. Müller opened the folder. The first document was a casualty summary covering June 1943 to June 1944. German forces had lost 2,147 tanks during that period. Expected, but 1,091 of those tanks had been destroyed by German anti-tank weapons. Brenner read the number twice. 1,091 tanks, destroyed by German soldiers. Müller said the number was confirmed, cross-referenced against unit reports, wreckage analysis, survivor interviews. The data was solid. Brenner asked how this was possible. Müller said identification failures, training failures, panic, chaos, poor visibility, operators firing at anything that moved. Brenner asked for specifics. Müller pulled out a stack of photographs. Each showed a destroyed German tank. Brenner picked up the first photograph. Panzer IV, hull split open, turret blown off, bodies visible in the wreckage. Müller said this tank was destroyed outside Caen on June 23rd. British forces were advancing. The tank was retreating through a village. A German infantry squad saw it approaching through smoke and dust. Visibility was 50 meters. The squad leader ordered his men to fire Panzerfausts. 3 hits within 2 seconds. The entire crew burned to death. The squad leader realized his mistake when he saw German uniforms on the bodies. The squad leader shot himself. His body was found next to the wreckage. Brenner put the photograph down. He felt sick. Müller continued. The next photograph showed a Panther destroyed near Minsk on July 8th. Weber's tank. Brenner recognized it from the tribunal. Müller said this was the tank that got Weber executed. 4 men died because a Panzerfaust team could not identify German armor. Weber killed 3 soldiers for their mistake. The judges killed Weber for his response. 7 men dead, 1 tank destroyed, all German. Muller had 47 more photographs just like it. Brenner asked how many of these cases involved identification failures. Muller said 843, nearly 80%. Operators firing at German tanks because they could not see markings, because visibility was poor, because they had been told to fire at anything that moved, because they had 4 hours of training and no experience. The remaining 248 cases were accidental hits, operators missing their intended targets and striking German tanks nearby, operators tripping while firing, operators being killed by backblast and their weapons detonating randomly. Brenner asked Muller where this data came from. Muller said he had spent 4 months visiting destroyed tank positions, interviewing survivors, examining wreckage, taking photographs, reading unit reports, cross-referencing casualty lists. The High Command had ordered the investigation in March after losses exceeded projections. Muller had been told to find out why so many German tanks were being destroyed without corresponding enemy contact reports. Muller found the answer. German tanks were being destroyed by German weapons. Brenner asked if the High Command knew. Muller said yes. Brenner felt something collapse inside him. The High Command knew. They had ordered the investigation. They had received Muller's preliminary report in May. They had acknowledged the problem. And then they had done nothing. Brenner asked why. Muller said he did not know. Brenner told Muller to find out. 2 days later, Brenner and Muller drove to Kummersdorf weapons testing facility 40 kilometers south of Berlin. Brenner had requested permission to observe Panzerfaust training. Permission was granted. Brenner wanted to see how soldiers were being taught to use a weapon that was killing more Germans than enemies. They arrived at 1400 hours. The training officer was Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, 24 years old. Richter had been training Panzerfaust operators for 8 months. Richter told Brenner that current training protocol required 4 hours of instruction, followed by 1 live-fire exercise. Brenner asked how much training was required 6 months earlier. Richter said 3 weeks. Brenner asked why the reduction. Richter said Germany no longer had 3 weeks to train soldiers. Recruits were needed at the front immediately. 4 hours was the minimum time required to teach basic operation. Anything less, and soldiers would kill themselves trying to fire the weapon. Brenner watched the training. 32 recruits, ages 16 to 49. Most had been civilians 2 weeks earlier. The training consisted of Richter explaining how to aim the Panzerfaust, how to pull the trigger, how to avoid the backblast. Richter spent 11 minutes on instruction, then he told the recruits to line up for live fire. The first recruit stepped up to the firing line. He was 17, hands shaking. Richter helped him lift the Panzerfaust onto his shoulder and aim at a wooden target shaped like a tank. The target was 40 meters away. Richter told the recruit to fire when ready. The recruit pulled the trigger. The weapon roared. The backblast erupted. The recruit fell forward from the recoil. The warhead missed the target by 6 meters. Richter told him that was acceptable. The recruit would be sent to the front tomorrow. Brenner watched 23 more recruits fire. 14 missed the target. 3 dropped their weapons after firing because the recoil surprised them. 1 recruit aimed the weapon backward and nearly killed Richter with the backblast. Richter screamed at the recruit for 30 seconds and then moved on to the next soldier. There was no time for a second attempt. 32 recruits, 1 shot each, 4 hours of training. Tomorrow they would be at the front with Panzerfausts trying to stop Soviet tanks. Brenner asked Richter what percentage of operators survived their first engagement. Richter said approximately 60%. Brenner asked how many of the remaining 40% were killed by enemy fire. Richter said he did not have that data, but based on casualty reports he had reviewed, most were killed by their own weapons. Backblast injuries, accidental detonations, misidentification leading to retaliatory fire from their own tanks. The Panzerfaust was extremely effective at destroying tanks. It was also extremely effective at destroying the soldiers who fired it. Brenner asked if Richter had reported this to his superiors. Richter said yes. Every week, for 8 months. His reports went to Training Command. Training Command acknowledged them. Nothing changed. Training time kept decreasing. Recruit quality kept declining. Casualty rates kept increasing. Richter said he had stopped trying to fix the problem. His job was to train soldiers. He trained them. What happened after that was not his responsibility. Brenner returned to Berlin that evening and went directly to Muller's office. Muller was still there working. Brenner told Muller what he had seen. Muller said he was not surprised. Brenner asked what they should do. Muller said nothing. There was nothing they could do. The High Command knew about the problem. They had chosen to accept it. Brenner said they were murdering German soldiers. Muller said they were losing a war. There was a difference. Brenner did not accept that answer. The next morning, Brenner wrote a detailed report documenting everything Muller had found. 1,091 German tanks destroyed by German weapons. 4,147 German soldiers killed by their own anti-tank systems. Training reduced to 4 hours. 40% operator mortality rate in first engagement. Brenner documented the tribunal. He documented Weber's execution. He documented what Richter had told him. Brenner concluded that the Panzerfaust program was causing more German casualties than it was preventing. He recommended immediate suspension of production pending a complete review of training protocols and operational procedures. Brenner submitted the report to Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. He submitted it directly to General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations Staff. Brenner marked the report urgent. He requested an immediate meeting to discuss the findings. Brenner thought he was doing his duty. He thought he was protecting German soldiers. He was wrong. 3 days later, Brenner was summoned to Jodl's office. Brenner arrived expecting to discuss his report. Jodl did not mention the report. Jodl told Brenner that he was being reassigned, effective immediately. Brenner was being transferred to the 6th Army on the Eastern Front. Brenner said he was a staff officer with no combat command experience. Jodl said Brenner's experience was no longer required in Berlin. The 6th Army needed officers who understood logistics. Brenner would be perfect. Brenner understood what this meant. The 6th Army was being destroyed by the Soviets. Sending Brenner there was a death sentence. Brenner asked about his report. Jodl said the report had been reviewed and filed. No action would be taken. Brenner asked why. Jodl's expression changed. Jodl told Brenner to sit down. Jodl explained that Germany was losing the war. Everyone at the High Command knew this. The Soviets were destroying German armies faster than they could be replaced. The Western Allies controlled France and were advancing into Germany. German industry was collapsing. The war would be over within a year, maybe less. The only question was how long Germany could delay the inevitable. Every week of delay meant more German civilians could evacuate east, more time to destroy sensitive documents, more time to negotiate better surrender terms. The Panzerfaust was the most effective weapon Germany had for delaying Soviet armor advances. Yes, it killed German soldiers. Yes, it destroyed German tanks. But without the Panzerfaust, German infantry would be defenseless against Soviet armor. The war would end in weeks instead of months. Jodl said the High Command had made a choice. Accept casualties from the Panzerfaust or accept total collapse. They chose casualties. Brenner's report threatened that choice. If Brenner's recommendations were implemented, Panzerfaust production would stop. Training would take weeks. Deployment would slow. Soviet tanks would advance unopposed. More German civilians would die. More territory would be lost. The war would end faster. That was unacceptable. Jodl told Brenner his transfer orders were final. Brenner would report to the 6th Army in 2 weeks. His replacement had already been selected. Brenner's Casualty Analysis Division would continue operating without him. Future reports would not question operational weapons systems. Jodl dismissed Brenner. Brenner left the office understanding he had been sentenced to death for telling the truth. Brenner spent the next week preparing for his transfer. Muller found him on his last day in Berlin. Muller asked what Brenner planned to do. Brenner said he would report to the Sixth Army as ordered. Muller asked if Brenner regretted writing the report. Brenner said no. Someone had to document what was happening. Someone had to tell the truth, even if no one wanted to hear it. Muller said he had something to tell Brenner. Muller's younger brother had been a Panther tank commander. Past tense. 3 weeks ago, Muller's brother was killed when a Panzerfaust hit his tank during a retreat near Lvov. The operator thought he was firing at a Soviet tank. He was wrong. Muller's brother burned to death along with his entire crew. The operator was 16 years old. After the battle, the operator walked into the forest and hanged himself. Muller found out about his brother's death the same week he started compiling the casualty report for Brenner. Muller had spent 4 months documenting how the Panzerfaust was killing German soldiers. Every photograph he showed Brenner, every statistic, every casualty report. Muller knew his own brother was in that data. Muller had compiled a report that proved his brother died because Germany was using a weapon it could not train soldiers to operate safely, and the High Command had ignored it. Brenner asked why Muller never mentioned his brother. Muller said it would not have changed anything. The High Command did not care about one dead tank commander. They did not care about 1,091 dead tank crews. They cared about delaying Soviet advances. Nothing else mattered. Brenner understood. The truth did not matter when you were losing a war. 2 weeks later, Brenner reported to the Sixth Army. He was assigned to a logistics unit near Krakow. 3 days after his arrival, Soviet forces attacked. Brenner's unit was overrun within 6 hours. Brenner survived the initial assault. He was captured by Soviet infantry on August 21, 1944. He spent the next 11 years in a Soviet labor camp. He never returned to Germany. Muller remained in Berlin. He continued compiling casualty reports. He never mentioned the Panzerfaust problem again. His reports documented losses without questioning causes. In September 1944, German forces destroyed 380 enemy tanks with Panzerfausts. They also destroyed 140 German tanks. The ratio was approaching 1 German tank lost for every 3 enemy tanks destroyed. Muller filed the report and recommended increased production. His superiors approved. By the end of the war, Panzerfausts had destroyed approximately 4,200 enemy tanks. They had also destroyed approximately 1,700 German tanks. More than 6,000 German soldiers died from Panzerfaust-related incidents: friendly fire, training accidents, backblast injuries, misidentification. The weapon killed more Germans than any other German anti-tank system. Production continued until the final days of the war. No one ever suspended the program. No one ever fixed the training. No one ever acknowledged the problem publicly. Ernst Weber was executed by firing squad on July 5, 1944, for murdering 3 German soldiers who destroyed his tank. Klaus Richter continued training Panzerfaust operators until Berlin fell. He survived the war. Heinrich Brenner died in a Soviet labor camp in 1955. Franz Müller disappeared during the fall of Berlin. His body was never found. The classified reports documenting Panzerfaust casualties were destroyed when Soviet forces captured Wehrmacht headquarters. The truth was buried with the men who tried to expose it. February 12, 1945. 2130 hours. Hitler Youth Training Barracks, Pomerania. 15-year-old Martin Kessler stood in formation holding a Panzerfaust he had received 17 minutes ago. 263 boys stood with him, ages 14 to 16. Most had been students 3 weeks earlier. Now they wore uniforms too large for their bodies and held anti-tank weapons heavier than their school bags and waited for someone to tell them how not to die. Martin had never fired a gun. He had never seen a dead body. In 2 days, he would see more corpses than he could count, and most of them would be children. The training officer was Hauptmann Dieter Lang, 41 years old. Lang had lost his left arm at Stalingrad. The stump ended just below the elbow. Lang used to hide it under his uniform. Now he let everyone see it. He wanted the boys to understand what war meant. Lang walked down the formation inspecting them. Most could barely lift their Panzerfausts. Some were crying, others had wet themselves and were trying to hide it. Lang stopped in front of Martin and asked if he understood what he was holding. Martin said it was a weapon. Lang said no. It was a choice. Use it correctly and maybe you kill an enemy. Use it incorrectly and you kill yourself and everyone around you. Which outcome did Martin prefer? Martin did not answer. Lang told him he would learn the answer soon enough. Lang gathered the boys in a training yard and began explaining the Panzerfaust. He spoke quickly. The Soviets were 60 kilometers away. These boys had 12 hours to learn everything. Lang told them the weapon was simple. Point at tank. Pull trigger. Warhead destroys tank. But there were 3 rules. Rule 1. Never fire from enclosed spaces or you will burn alive from the backblast. Rule 2. Never let anyone stand behind you within 10 meters or they will burn alive from the backblast. Rule 3. Never fire at anything unless you are absolutely certain it is an enemy tank. If you break Rule 3, you will kill German soldiers and then a German officer will execute you for murder. Lang looked at the 263 boys. He said he needed to tell them something their commanders would not say. Based on casualty data from the Eastern Front, approximately 40% of Panzerfaust operators died in their first engagement. That meant 105 boys in this formation would be dead within 1 week. Lang paused. He let the number sink in. Then he said the actual number would be higher. These boys had less training than the soldiers in the casualty reports. Lang's personal estimate was 150 deaths, more than half. Lang said if any boy wanted to run away, now was the time. No one moved. Lang said that was unfortunate because running away might have been the smartest tactical decision any of them would ever make. A boy named Peter Hoffman raised his hand, 14 years old. Peter asked what happened if visibility was too poor to identify a tank. Lang said, "Then you do not fire." Peter said, "But what if the tank is firing at you?" Lang said, "If the tank is firing at you, it is probably Soviet." Probably? Peter asked what probably meant. Lang said it meant in the chaos of battle, German tanks sometimes fired at German positions by mistake. If Peter shot at a tank and it turned out to be German, then Peter would have murdered his own soldiers. The choice would be his. Make it wrong and die for it. Lang took the boys to a firing range. There were only 30 training rounds available. Lang apologized. Only 30 boys would actually fire the weapon. The other 233 would go into combat, having never pulled a trigger. Lang said this was the best training Germany could provide. If the boys did not like it, they could complain to the High Command in Berlin. If Berlin had not been bombed into rubble. If the High Command still existed. Lang was no longer certain either was true. The first boy to fire was named Franz Schneider, 16 years old, tallest in the formation. Franz lifted the Panzerfaust and aimed at a wooden target 40 meters away. Lang reminded Franz to check behind him. Franz looked. 3 boys stood 8 meters back, too close. Franz told them to move. They did not react fast enough. Lang screamed at them to run. They ran. Franz pulled the trigger. The Panzerfaust roared. The backblast erupted in a cone of fire 10 meters long. The 3 boys who had been standing too close felt the heat wash over them, even though they had moved. One of them vomited. The warhead hit the target dead center and exploded. Franz fell forward from the recoil. He dropped the empty tube and stood up smiling. He had hit the target. Lang told Franz that was excellent shooting. Franz would be very effective at killing Soviet tanks. Franz asked when he would receive another Panzerfaust. Lang said in 2 days. Franz would be issued 2 weapons. He would fire both. Then he would either be dead or waiting for resupply that would never arrive. Franz stopped smiling. The 4th boy to fire was named Otto Bauer. 14 years old, smallest in the formation. Weight maybe 45 kilograms. Otto could barely lift the Panzerfaust. Lang helped him position it on his shoulder. Lang asked if Otto understood how to brace for the recoil. Otto nodded, but his face said he did not understand. Lang told Otto to plant his feet, to lean forward, to hold the weapon tight against his shoulder. Otto said he would try. Lang said trying was not good enough. Otto needed to do it correctly, or the recoil would knock him down. Otto said he understood. Lang stepped back and looked at Otto, standing there with a weapon too heavy for him to control. Lang thought about stopping the exercise. Lang thought about telling Otto to sit down. But there were 262 other boys waiting, and only 26 training rounds left, and the Soviets were 60 kilometers away. Lang told Otto to fire when ready. Otto pulled the trigger. The weapon roared. Otto was not braced correctly. The recoil knocked him backward. Otto fell. The Panzerfaust fell with him. The weapon was still firing as it fell. The barrel angled sideways. The backblast erupted horizontally instead of backward. The cone of superheated gas and flame swept across the training yard like dragonfire. Lang saw it coming. Lang tried to move. The backblast hit him directly across the chest and face. The heat was over 1,000 degrees. Lang's uniform ignited instantly. Lang was thrown 6 meters backward. He landed hard. His body was on fire. Instructors ran toward him with blankets. They tried to smother the flames. Lang was screaming, not words, just sound. The kind of sound a human makes when they understand they are dying. The instructors extinguished the flames after 30 seconds. Lang's face was gone. Not burned. Gone. The skin had melted away. His chest was black and red and smoking. Lang tried to speak. Blood came out instead of words. Lang looked directly at Martin. Martin was standing 10 meters away, watching. Lang tried to raise his remaining hand. The hand that was not just a stump. Lang's fingers were burning. Lang pointed at the boys. Lang was trying to say something. Then Lang stopped moving. Otto sat on the ground staring at Lang's body. Otto's hands were shaking. Otto started to cry. Not quiet crying, loud sobbing, the kind that makes your whole body shake. Otto kept saying he was sorry. He kept saying it was an accident. He kept saying he did not mean to do it. An officer arrived 7 minutes later. Oberleutnant Karl Fischer, 35 years old. Fischer had been training regular infantry and knew nothing about Panzerfausts. But Lang was dead, and someone needed to finish training these boys. Fischer looked at Lang's body. Then he looked at Otto, crying on the ground. Fischer walked over to Otto and told him to stand up. Otto could not move. His legs would not work. Fischer told him again, "Stand up." Otto tried. He got to his knees but could not go further. He looked up at Fischer and said he was sorry. Fischer pulled out his pistol. He pressed the barrel against Otto's forehead. Otto's eyes went wide. Otto said, "Please." Fischer said Lang was the only man in this facility who knew how to properly train Panzerfaust operators. Lang was now dead because Otto could not follow simple instructions. The penalty for that level of incompetence was death. Otto started begging. "Please, it was an accident. Please. I did not mean to. Please, I am sorry. Please." Fischer pulled the trigger. The gunshot was louder than the Panzerfaust. Otto fell backward. Blood pooled on the frozen ground. The other boys stared. No one moved. No one spoke. Fischer turned to face the formation. He told them that anyone who could not follow orders would receive the same treatment. Accidents were not acceptable. Incompetence was not acceptable. Weakness was not acceptable. The only thing that was acceptable was perfect execution of their duties. Did everyone understand? The boys nodded. Fischer told them to say it out loud. The boys said, "Yes, sir," in unison. Fischer said, "Good." Training would continue. Martin could not stop looking at Otto's body. Blood was spreading across the ground. The snow around Otto's head was turning red. Martin thought about the fact that Otto had been alive 2 minutes ago. Otto had been crying. Otto had been terrified. Now Otto was just meat on the ground, and everyone was pretending it had not happened. The fifth boy stepped up to fire. His name was Klaus Richter, 15 years old. Klaus was shaking so badly he could barely hold the Panzerfaust. Fischer told him to calm down. Klaus said he could not. Fischer said if Klaus could not calm down, then Klaus would end up like Otto. Klaus tried to breathe. He tried to steady his hands. It did not work. Klaus aimed at the target anyway. Klaus pulled the trigger. The warhead flew wide and exploded 80 meters beyond the target. Fischer told Klaus he had just wasted a training round and would probably die in combat because he could not aim properly. Klaus asked if he could try again. Fischer said no. Klaus would learn from his mistakes in actual battle, or he would not learn at all. By midnight, 30 boys had fired. 19 hit the target. 11 missed. 2 boys dropped their weapons after firing. 1 boy aimed backward and nearly killed 3 others with the backblast. Fischer screamed at that boy for 2 minutes and then moved on. There was no time for corrections. There was only time to keep moving until every training round was gone. Martin stood watching. Martin had not fired. Martin had watched Otto kill Lang. Martin had watched Fischer execute Otto. Martin understood that in 2 days he would be in a trench with this weapon, and he would have no idea how to use it because he had never pulled the trigger. Fischer gathered the boys after midnight. He told them they would deploy to the Oder River in 36 hours. Soviet forces were expected to attack within 48 hours. The boys would be assigned to infantry units and given Panzerfausts. Their job was to stop Soviet armor. Fischer said the boys should expect to engage at very close range, 30 meters or less. At that distance, you cannot miss. But at that distance, Soviet machine gunners cannot miss either. You will have 1 shot before you are killed. Make it count. A boy named Matthias Koch raised his hand. 16 years old. Matthias asked what happened if they could not get close enough to fire. Fischer said, "Then you die without firing." Matthias asked if there was any way to avoid being spotted. Fischer said yes. Hide until the tank is directly over your position. Stand up and fire straight up into the belly armor. The tank will be too close to traverse its gun and shoot you. But the infantry supporting the tank will shoot you immediately. Matthias asked if there was any way to survive after firing. Fischer said no. Martin raised his hand. He asked how many Soviet tanks they were expected to face. Fischer said intelligence indicated at least 400 tanks would attack their sector. Martin asked how many Panzerfausts they had. Fischer said each boy would receive 2. Martin did the math in his head. 526 Panzerfausts. Even if every single shot destroyed a tank, there would still be hundreds more. Martin asked what happened when they ran out of Panzerfausts. Fischer said they would die. Martin asked if there was a plan to resupply. Fischer said no. There was no resupply plan. Once you fire your 2 weapons, you retreat into the woods and wait for orders that will probably never come. The boys were dismissed at 200 hours. Martin returned to his bunk and tried to sleep. He thought about Otto. Otto had been crying. Otto had been begging. Fischer had killed him anyway. Martin wondered how many of them would die like Otto. Martin wondered if it mattered how you died when you were 15 years old and hundreds of kilometers from home. February 14th, 0600 hours. The boys were loaded onto trucks. They arrived at defensive positions along the Oder River at 1400 hours. The trenches were partially collapsed. Water filled the bottom. Bodies from previous battles had not been removed. Martin was assigned to a trench with 11 other boys. A sergeant named Wilhelm Brandt was in command, 47 years old, former schoolteacher. Brandt told the boys to spread out. When Soviet tanks came, the boys were to wait until 30 meters and then fire. After firing, they should reload. One boy asked reload with what? Brandt said he did not know. Soviet artillery began at 400 hours on February 15th. The barrage lasted 2 hours. Martin pressed himself into the mud and waited. Shells collapsed sections of trench. Martin heard screaming. When the artillery stopped, Martin lifted his head. 3 boys were gone, buried alive. Brandt was bleeding from his head. Brandt told them to prepare for tanks. Martin heard engines. He looked over the trench edge, T-34s advancing in a line. Martin counted 14 tanks in his sector. He had 2 Panzerfausts. The math was impossible. The boy next to Martin was named Stefan Vogel, 15 years old. Stefan had never fired a Panzerfaust. Stefan asked Martin what to do. Martin said, "Wait until they are close." Stefan asked how close. Martin said 30 meters. Stefan asked how they would know when that was. Martin had no answer. A tank approached, 100 meters. 80 meters. Martin lifted his Panzerfaust. Stefan did the same. 60 meters. Brandt was shouting something Martin could not hear. 40 meters. The tank's machine gun opened fire. Bullets tore through the dirt. Stefan stood up to shoot. A burst hit Stefan in the chest. Stefan fell backward into the trench. Blood poured from his mouth. His eyes were still open. He tried to say something, then he stopped breathing. 30 meters. Martin stood and aimed. The tank was massive, louder than anything Martin had experienced. Martin pulled the trigger. The Panzerfaust roared. The backblast erupted behind him. Martin heard screaming. He did not turn around. The warhead hit the tank's front armor and detonated. The tank stopped. Smoke poured from the hatches. Martin had destroyed a Soviet tank. Martin turned to grab his second weapon. Brandt was on fire. The backblast had hit him. Brandt was rolling in the mud trying to extinguish the flames. 2 other boys were also burning. One of them was running, the other had fallen and was not moving. Martin ran to Brandt. Brandt's uniform was smoking. His face was burned. Brandt grabbed Martin's arm with a hand that was still on fire. Brandt pulled Martin close. Brandt said Martin's name. Brandt tried to say something else. Blood came out. Brandt's grip weakened. His hand fell away. Brandt looked at Martin one more time. Brandt's lips moved. Martin thought Brandt was trying to say it was not Martin's fault. Then Brandt stopped moving. Martin stared at Brandt's body. Martin had killed him. Martin's weapon had burned Brandt alive. Martin had followed his training. Martin had destroyed an enemy tank. And Martin had murdered the man who was supposed to keep him alive. Another tank was approaching. 50 meters. Martin picked up his second Panzerfaust. His hands were shaking. He could smell burning flesh. He could hear someone screaming behind him, but he did not turn around to see who it was. Martin aimed at the tank. Martin pulled the trigger. The backblast erupted again. More screaming. Martin did not look. The warhead missed the tank by 8 meters and exploded in dirt. The tank kept advancing. Martin had no more weapons. Martin was defenseless. The tank rolled over Martin's trench. The weight collapsed the walls. Dirt and mud fell on Martin. Martin tried to climb out, but the mud was too heavy. The trench was collapsing. Martin was being buried alive. Dirt filled his mouth. Martin tried to breathe, but only got mud. Martin tried to dig, but his arms would not move. The weight was crushing his chest. Martin thought about his mother. She was in Hamburg, or she had been in Hamburg before the bombing. Martin did not know if she was still alive. Martin wanted to tell her he was sorry. Sorry for joining the Hitler Youth. Sorry for believing the propaganda. Sorry for thinking war was glorious. Sorry for dying in a trench 600 kilometers from home. Martin tried to scream, but the mud filled his lungs. Everything went dark. Martin woke up in silence. He thought he was dead. He tried to move. His body hurt. Martin opened his eyes. Soviet soldiers were standing over him. They had pulled him from the collapsed trench. They thought he was dead. When Martin started breathing, they realized he was alive. They took him prisoner. Martin was 15 years old. He had been in combat for 27 minutes. He had destroyed 1 Soviet tank. He had killed 3 German soldiers with backblast. He had watched 12 boys die. Martin spent the next 4 years in a Soviet prisoner of war camp. He was released in 1949. He returned to Germany. He never spoke about the war. He never told anyone what happened at the Oder River. When people asked where he had been during the war, Martin said he did not remember. People thought he had trauma. They were right. Martin died in 1987. His family never knew he had been a soldier. Of the 263 boys in Martin's Hitler Youth Unit, 197 died in the first week of combat. 74% mortality rate. 74 boys were killed by enemy fire. 86 were killed by their own weapons. Backblast, accidental detonations, misidentification leading to executions. 37 boys were shot by German officers for cowardice or refusal to fight. The remaining 66 boys were captured or went missing. Soviet records indicate most captured Hitler Youth died in labor camps. Only 9 boys from Martin's unit survived the war and returned to Germany. None of them ever spoke about what happened. None of them told their families. None of them sought recognition or medals or acknowledgement. They just lived their lives and pretended those 2 days in February 1945 had never occurred. The truth died with them. No one knows their names. No one remembers their faces. They were children who were given weapons they did not know how to use and sent to fight a war that had already been lost. History does not record their deaths as tragic. History records them as casualties, numbers in a report, statistics in a database. Nothing more. April 28, 1945, 16:30 hours. Führerbunker, Berlin. Hauptmann Werner Vogel heard the explosion before he felt it. The ceiling shook. Concrete dust rained down. Someone was screaming above ground. Vogel stood in a storage room surrounded by 847 Panzerfausts stacked against walls that might collapse at any moment. Soviet tanks were 3 blocks away. German defensive lines were disintegrating. Vogel had spent 3 years distributing weapons to soldiers. Now there were no soldiers left, just weapons. Thousands of weapons that no one would ever use. The door burst open. A soldier stumbled in. Blood covered his face. His uniform was torn. His hands were shaking. The soldier was maybe 19 years old, maybe younger. Hard to tell anymore. The soldier saw the Panzerfausts and started grabbing them. Vogel asked what unit the soldier belonged to. The soldier said there was no unit. Everyone was dead. The soldier needed weapons. Soviet tanks were rolling down Wilhelmstrasse. The soldier needed to stop them. Vogel asked if the soldier knew how to use a Panzerfaust. The soldier said no. Could Vogel teach him? Vogel said he could not. Vogel distributed weapons. Vogel did not train soldiers. The soldier took 2 Panzerfausts anyway and ran. Vogel heard the soldier's boots echoing in the corridor. Then another explosion. Then silence. The soldier was probably dead. Maybe the soldier had fired at a tank and been killed by return fire. Maybe the soldier had killed himself with backblast. Maybe the soldier had just been hit by artillery. The outcome did not matter. 1 more German soldier dead. 1 more weapon wasted. Vogel thought about the irony. For 3 years, Germany had produced Panzerfausts faster than soldiers could use them. Factories worked day and night. Production increased every month. By early 1945, Germany was manufacturing over 1 million Panzerfausts monthly. But there were no trained soldiers left. The armies had been destroyed. The survivors were old men and teenagers with no training and no chance. Vogel had 847 Panzerfausts in this room, probably 100,000 more scattered across Berlin. All useless. Vogel had tried to report the problems. In 1944, he submitted an analysis showing 30% of Panzerfaust casualties were self-inflicted. Friendly fire, training accidents, backblast injuries. His report was ignored. In January 1945, Vogel submitted another report. Volkssturm units suffered 60% casualties in first engagements. Most deaths were caused by improper weapon use rather than enemy action. That report was also ignored. By April, Vogel stopped submitting reports. There was no one left to read them. A voice called from the corridor. Sturmbannführer Karl Hoffmann entered. 42 years old. SS. Hoffmann commanded one of the last functional combat units in Berlin, 37 men holding a position near the Reichstag. Hoffmann asked how many Panzerfausts were available. Vogel said 847. Hoffmann said he needed all of them. Soviet tanks were advancing on his position. Without anti-tank weapons, his unit would be overrun in hours. Vogel told Hoffmann to take whatever he needed. Hoffmann called his men inside. 37 soldiers filed in. Ages ranged from 16 to 53. Most looked exhausted. Several were wounded. Hoffmann ordered each man to take 2 Panzerfausts. The soldiers obeyed mechanically. One soldier asked Hoffmann about training. Hoffmann said there was no time. The soldier asked if anyone in the unit had fired a Panzerfaust before. Hoffmann surveyed his men. No one raised a hand. Hoffmann said they would learn by necessity. The soldier asked what happened if they made mistakes. Hoffmann said Soviet bullets would correct any errors. Vogel watched the unit prepare to leave. He felt obligated to say something. Vogel told Hoffmann that improper use of Panzerfausts resulted in extremely high friendly fire casualties. Backblast alone killed approximately 15% of untrained operators. Hoffmann asked if Vogel had a better solution. Vogel did not. Hoffmann said then they would use the weapons and accept the casualties. Dying from backblast was preferable to dying defenseless under tank treads. Hoffmann's unit left with 74 Panzerfausts. Vogel knew he would never see those men again. Maybe some would destroy Soviet tanks. Maybe some would die from their own weapons. The distinction had stopped mattering. Everyone was dying. The method was irrelevant. Vogel sat on an ammunition crate and thought about the past 3 years. He had processed thousands of casualty reports. He had compiled statistics that most officers never saw. Vogel knew things the High Command had deliberately ignored. The Panzerfaust had destroyed approximately 23,000 Allied tanks since 1943. But it had also destroyed approximately 4,600 German tanks through misidentification and friendly fire. The weapon had killed approximately 11,000 German soldiers through training accidents, backblast casualties, and execution for killing their own forces. The High Command had known all of this. They had chosen to increase production anyway. An hour passed. Vogel heard explosions from Hoffmann's direction, heavy machine gun fire, then artillery, then nothing. Hoffmann's unit had been eliminated. 37 men gone, 74 Panzerfausts wasted. Maybe they had slowed the Soviet advance by minutes. Maybe they had accomplished nothing. Vogel would never know. April 29th. 07:30 hours. Vogel received new orders. Destroy all weapons in the bunker. Soviets were closing in. The weapons could not be captured. Vogel was instructed to use thermite charges. Vogel gathered the necessary equipment and returned to the storage room. 773 Panzerfausts remained. Vogel began placing charges. Footsteps in the corridor. A man appeared in the doorway. Gefreiter Klaus Becker, 22 years old. Wehrmacht. Klaus's uniform was filthy. His face was covered in dried blood. Klaus stared at the Panzerfausts. Klaus asked if he could take one. Vogel said no. These weapons were being destroyed. Klaus asked why. Vogel explained the orders. Klaus said that made no sense. German soldiers needed weapons. Vogel said there were no German soldiers left, just scattered individuals with no training and no coordination. Giving them weapons would only result in more friendly fire casualties. Klaus said Vogel was wrong. Klaus had been at Silo Heights in March. Klaus had seen what happened when untrained soldiers used Panzerfausts. Klaus had killed 4 German soldiers with backblast. Klaus had watched a 17-year-old boy get executed for refusing to fire. Klaus had fired 2 Panzerfausts and watched both times as his own weapon murdered the men behind him. Klaus said he understood exactly what these weapons did, and Klaus still wanted one, because dying fighting was better than dying helpless. Vogel looked at Klaus. Klaus was barely standing. Exhaustion, trauma, desperation. Vogel asked what Klaus thought one Panzerfaust would accomplish. Klaus said probably nothing. But Klaus needed to try. Vogel said Klaus would probably die from backblast or be executed for friendly fire. Klaus said he had already killed his own soldiers. One more death would not change anything. Vogel made a decision. Vogel told Klaus to take 2 Panzerfausts. Klaus asked why Vogel was helping. Vogel said he did not know anymore. Maybe because Klaus was honest about what the weapons did. Maybe because Vogel was tired of following orders that made no sense. Maybe because nothing mattered anymore. Klaus took the weapons and left. Vogel heard an explosion 30 minutes later, then screaming. Vogel recognized the sound. Backblast in an enclosed space. Klaus had probably fired from a building or basement. The backblast had probably killed Klaus along with anyone near him. Vogel had given Klaus those weapons. Vogel had enabled Klaus's death. Vogel returned to placing thermite charges. Vogel activated the charges and retreated. The storage room erupted in white-hot flames. The Panzerfausts detonated in a chain reaction. The explosion shook the entire bunker. When the fire died, nothing remained except melted metal and ash. 3 years of weapons production destroyed in seconds. April 30th, 1400 hours. Vogel learned Hitler had committed suicide. The war was over in all but name. Vogel received orders to evacuate. Before leaving, Vogel wrote a final report. Vogel documented everything: production numbers, casualty statistics, friendly fire rates, training failures, how the High Command had known and done nothing. Vogel wrote the truth knowing no one would read it. Vogel sealed the report in an envelope and left it in his office. Vogel hoped someone would find it, someone who would document what really happened, someone who would ensure the truth survived. Soviet forces captured the bunker on May 2nd. They destroyed or looted everything. Vogel's report was burned with thousands of other documents. The truth was lost. Vogel surrendered to Soviet forces on May 3rd. He spent 8 years in a labor camp, released in 1953, returned to Germany. Never spoke about the war. When asked what he did, Vogel said he had been a clerk. People did not press. Vogel died in 1979. His obituary said he served in the Wehrmacht. Nothing more. Klaus Becker survived the war. 42 years in a factory in Bavaria. Never told anyone about Silo Heights. Never mentioned Joseph Hartmann or the soldiers he killed. Klaus died in 1987. His gravestone says veteran. Nothing about what he did. Martin Kessler survived. 4 years in Soviet prison. Returned in 1949. Married. 3 children. Never told them about the Oder River. Never mentioned the 12 boys who died in 27 minutes. Martin died in 1987. His family knew he served. They never knew the details. Heinrich Brenner died in Soviet captivity in 1955. Franz Müller disappeared in Berlin. Never found. Ernst Weber was executed for murdering 3 soldiers who destroyed his tank. The list continues. After the war, Allied investigators examined German documents. They found production records, deployment orders, casualty summaries. The investigators concluded the Panzerfaust was highly effective. They were correct, but the casualty summaries only showed total losses, not causes. The Allies never knew the Panzerfaust had killed thousands of German soldiers through friendly fire and training failures. In 1982, a German historian named Dr. Friedrich Klein discovered fragments of data in Soviet archives. Unusually high friendly fire rates in Panzerfaust equipped units. Klein investigated, found after-action reports, survivor testimonies, unit logs. Klein pieced together the truth. Published findings in 1985. No one cared. The Cold War dominated attention. The past was irrelevant. The Panzerfaust was produced until April 28, 1945, 2 days before Hitler's suicide. Germany manufactured anti-tank weapons when there were no soldiers to use them. The factories kept running. The workers kept working. The system functioned while everything collapsed. By May 1945, approximately 2 million unused Panzerfausts remained scattered across Germany. Allied forces destroyed most. Some were studied. Few ended in museums. The rest were forgotten, like the soldiers who used them, like the truth about what happened. The Panzerfaust destroyed approximately 23,000 Allied tanks during the war, one of the most effective anti-tank weapons ever created. But it also destroyed approximately 4,600 German tanks and killed approximately 11,000 German soldiers through friendly fire and improper use. The weapon Germany created to save itself became a weapon that helped destroy it from within. That truth no one wanted to acknowledge. That truth died with the men who knew it. That truth remains buried 80 years later.